Good afternoon. That's a hard act to follow. Secondly, I've always come to this hall to listen, not to talk. And many years and many pounds ago, I came here regularly. I never slept in this hall because we had very good people always speaking, and we've heard that today. So I'm a little unused to speaking here and not listening. I just wanted to make clear to everybody two things. You should study, my children haven't listened to this, and my grandchildren haven't listened to this, but it's advice I'll give anyways. Two things you should study here. One is math, and the other is philosophy. Because with those two things, at least the last thing, you can never get a job, so you have to do a lot of things. I would also want to say to all of you that one of the biggest lies and myths that should be totally taken care of is the squirrels are cuter than the girls at the University of Chicago. That is not true. I still remember today a girl, I was too timid to talk to her, but I saw her in a wonderful class of the metaphysical poets. And I still remember, I'm still seeking her, but it's never too late to get in trouble. Like many of you, I was very surprised and worried, preoccupied, but really amazed at what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa. And there are historical processes like the American Revolution of big regional movements that start tying together, like the liberation movements during the 19th century in Latin America and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The one thing you know about these processes is where they start, but never where they end. But I really got worried when I saw that Egypt, the people who were handling Egypt, were the army that was in charge of it, named a commission of wise men to make a new constitution in 9 days. And you know, it took God 7 days to do the creation, and he had to rest one of them. So I said, what is happening? And I started thinking, with all the experience and all the processes, what is the cornerstone of democracy? And I came to the conclusion that a cornerstone is, first of all, the beginning, the first thing you put down. In a cornerstone, and the word cornerstone exists in the Bible, the Old Testament, since the building of the Temple of Solomon. And you put this cornerstone down, and it's the first thing you do, and inherent in that are the X, Y, and Z axis. It carries like a DNA. It carries the essence of what you hope to achieve in that building. Because the way it is placed and the way it is cut almost defines what you're going to do. And I started to think about it, and I said, I think the cornerstone of democracy is the Constitution. The Constitution is the beginning of it, and it is something that we have to understand because it is a covenant. All the big monotheistic religions have in their gene pool the idea that you make a covenant with God. And when you do a constitution, you're making a covenant with the people. It's not a mechanical plan. It's something that is a contract, if you want to say it, but it is a contract with the Lord, and it has two basic substantive points in it. And I think I would like to refer, if you'll let me, to quote a man that I'm sorry couldn't be at TED. He was from Illinois, and he did in 2 minutes what another man did in 2 hours, Abraham Lincoln, when he said the famous phrase 77 years ago, "Our father brought forth to this continent a new nation." He did not say a new republic. A new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That is the phrase, and it's very biblical in the sense that you're not talking about a republic or a monarchy, you're talking about a nation. And a nation was not exactly an area. It was an ethnic group, it was an area, it was many other things. And I think that the most important thing about a constitution is that it has to be conceived in liberty, meaning there can be no pressure, there can be no obligation to, and secondly, it has to be dedicated to the fact that all men are created equal. Pardon me for just a minute, I'm very devoted to water at this point. So, the concept of equality is the most important concept that has to be ingrained in what people understand a democracy. And it also comes from the fact that we have one God. Most of the big groups, Christianity, the Jewish religion, and the Muslim, are monotheistic. And in other times in the history of man, you had multiple gods. Still, God was better than the other person's God. You could be an equal. But we are all equal because we're all going to have one destiny. We're all going to die. We're all going to be born of a woman, and we're all going to die. And that makes us equal. If we could find somebody who, because of his intelligence, beauty, wealth, strength, could live forever, then we wouldn't be equal. But the youngest, the wealthiest, the poorest, the ugliest, the most beautiful, we're all going to end up in one place. And I think that this is the basis for the concept that has been so strong, that all people, Lincoln said it, all men, but he was talking about the human species. And of course, it doesn't mean that what's in the Constitution you behave with. The United States approved a great Constitution based on these, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. They had slaves. A terrible civil war had to get them to vote, and a long time they weren't permitted to exercise it. And of course, in 1820, some very vigorous Quaker women got together to get the vote for women. The women got the vote 100 years later. I read there's wonderful pages in American history when there's discussion between the leaders like Frederick Douglass and everything, and the women's vote saying, how come you're going to get it before we're going to get it? And he had to beg them. He said, we're coming out of slavery. The whole condition of being free is to have the vote, means you're equal. The fact that each person has one vote is something that's attractive in all societies. It sounds very equal and people love that. And I think that we have to take a look at what may sound mechanical, but it is a true important thing to take into account. A constitution cannot have contradictions. It has to be, I personally think the only constitution for people who want to become democratic is a parliamentarian constitution. I don't have time to talk about the American Constitution, but believe me, an American democracy in its constitution, it doesn't work. But in a parliamentary constitution, you can't have the power of the people coming from the same source. You can't elect a president and elect a Congress, because then it becomes a battle, and the people who run the armies or the armed forces usually win that battle. So I just think we have to accept that there's a very hard fact to accept. In our constitution in Bolivia, it's a presidential constitution, and when I was president, I asked an NGO to study it. From 1825, when we achieved our independence, to 1995, when the study was done, Bolivia had had less changes of government than Great Britain. And Great Britain is the model of democratic stability, and Bolivia is considered a basket case. So I think that you have to understand that, like trees in the wind, it has to be flexible, and we have to remember things like the Weimar Republic. How many of you remember that Hitler was named by the president chancellor, and he immediately, and the president gave him temporary executive powers? The most basic thing in the Constitution is the separation of powers. And any constitution like the ones that are being written in my continent, where the president can take the powers of the legislature, and they can't have a legitimacy that that's born from the same place. You can't have states who are almost as powerful as the government. You can't have a president who can take over powers of the legislative branch, and as it is a covenant, it's a contract before God, sworn, and in Bolivia we still, the people do swear on salt. It's a contract, so we have to, it's before God, and I think that the biggest point, and this is the point that we have to understand, a parliamentary system, that you can have a king, that works fine because his authority comes from God, but the people's authority can go to one power, and that's the legislative power. And the prime minister has to govern, but he can be changed regularly. In England, they change it all the time, and it sounds very stable. And it is very stable. But the king or the president, if he's born out of a supermajority, elected by the representatives of the people, never by the people, make it clear that those who govern are the representatives of the people, because the prime minister is born out of that, and the president is a man who comes out of a supermajority of a Congress. He has the authority, like the Queen of England, reigns but doesn't govern, like the Queen of England, who is the commander of the armed forces. Now, let's not look at it with a smile. If any of you have seen, and I suppose most of you have, the King's speech. Why was it so important, the King's speech? Winston Churchill wrote that speech. Why did he have to stop stuttering and say it? Because he represented the nation, the country. He was a symbol of the state, and Churchill was the man who had all the authority. He governed, but the other person, the king in this case, had the great authority of representing all. And you cannot have a president elected by the people and have a Congress elected by the people, because it's a continual battle between two legitimacies. That said, there are some basic rules in architecture. You can change them, they can be different. You can have a president who governs for a period of time, he reigns for a period of time, who can have great power. When there was the great danger of the military coup and the police took all the members of Congress prisoners in the Congress, The King of Spain, Juan Carlos, called up all the people who were the commanders of the armed forces who were already joining the coup. Franco, before giving him power, had made him study with everyone. He'd done all of military, naval, all of army, all of air. He had worked with all of them, so he called up and he said, this is not the solution. We have to respect the Constitution. And the army pulled back because of the authority of a person who represented Spain, not the government, represented Spain in the form of a very weakened monarch who looks very good, like his son does, fabulous in his uniforms, and they parade before the armed forces. But it makes the force, the monopoly of power, depend from the country, not from the government. So in those countries, rarely are the armed forces put into play against the people. The government can use the police because you have a symbol that this. All of these things sound very mechanical, and I understand that in all of this position that I'm talking about, you have to keep in mind one thing that Ortega and Gasset said, or I'd like to quote Whitehead and say that the secret of government is change with order and order with government, change with order and order with change. You can only achieve it if there is flexibility. And the last thing that we have to have in all constitutions, and maybe we should have a separate power, is the electoral branch. The health of democracy depends on a small detail, how the people are elected. If not, ask President Bush and President Gore, ex-Vice President Gore. And I think with those statements, I would like to thank you all for wishing, and we know that it's not something mechanical, but I would like to finish with some words of Abraham when he looks, that this nation under God, it is a covenant with God, and this has to be understood, and it'll be understood by the Muslims better than us who have become so secular, shall have a new birth of freedom. There's a difference between liberty and freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Thank you.